Good evening. I'm Patricia Van Skype, Director of the Lloyd Library and Museum, and I would like to welcome you to tonight's program, Natural Wonders, Pioneering Scientists of Cincinnati. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with the Lloyd Library, we are a independent scientific research library located in downtown Cincinnati. We're more than 140 years old, and we were founded by three pharmacists, the Lloyd brothers, who conducted research and manufactured nature-based drugs. But their interests were not limited to science and medicine. It extended to virtually every aspect of plants, health, and nature. And that was reflected through the collections they started and through our collections today that now number more than 250,000 items. One of our flagship programs is the fellowship program, where we award stipends to scholars to do research at the Lloyd. And tonight's presenter, Elissa Yancey, is one of our 2020 fellowship recipients. Just about everything about Elissa's project and her research changed due to COVID-19. During periods when the library was closed, she relied on digitized materials, which we provided for her, including cassette tapes that we converted to MP3 format. She supplemented our holdings with oral interviews and changed her fellowship project to a serial podcast, which was just released this month. Elissa is an award-winning journalist, educator, and nonprofit leader. She's an expert on Elissa and Annette Braun, who we will hear more about tonight. But what sets her research apart is the way she has been able to integrate the personal lives of the Braun sisters with their major scientific and environmental contributions. In addition to that, she brings to light the lesser known Elizabeth Brockschlager and her achievements as well. We're grateful for the creativity and flexibility that Elissa has brought to her research. And with that, I'd like to welcome Elissa Yancey.
Hi there.
Hi, Elissa.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so first of all, thank you all for coming and joining us this evening. I'm so glad you're here. I wanted to start by acknowledging that I am speaking to you from the occupied land of the traditional Shawnee and Miami peoples, past and present. I honor that land itself and the people who have stewarded it through generations, and I call upon all of us to commit to learn how to be better stewards of the land that we inhabit, and to honor and support Native botanists and leaders like Robin Wall Kimmerer as a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation. I also call upon us to honor the truth and do the work needed to achieve healing and reconciliation, especially as we're going to be talking about land and conserving it and plants and species that have been here since long before we have been. I'd like for us just to take a moment and sit with that. So thank you so much. My name, as Patricia said, is Elissa Yancey. I'm thrilled to be with you to talk about three of my favorite women, sisters Annette Francis and Emma Lucy Braun, and their friend and research companion, Elizabeth Brockschlager. So I'm going to start by talking about the Braun sisters. They were the first and third women to earn PhDs at the University of Cincinnati, though you're not likely to have heard of them, even if you, like me, attended the school. Their talent and drive led them to become world-renowned experts in botany and entomology, but unless you're a scientist, you're not likely to have heard of them, even if, like me, you grew up in their hometown of Cincinnati. And that's really where my fascination with the Doctors Braun started. I'm obsessed with stories that other people have overlooked. Hidden Figures, Ona Judge, the Doctors Blackwell. Notice a common thread? Yes, they are all women who have been, in general, overlooked by history. Which brings me to the third woman on the slide, Elizabeth Brockschlager, who left her collection of notes, letters, photos, and scrapbooks to the Lloyd Library. She was a beloved Cincinnati school teacher and expert botanist, and she met the Browns after she began teaching in Cincinnati. She became a close friend and research companion for them, and she often house sat when they took extended research trips. As they traveled, the sisters wrote back letters that inspired the serial podcast that Patricia mentioned earlier called Dear Elizabeth. Its fourth installment and final installment will launch on Monday, and letters that, along with the other documents in the collection, inspired this talk. Plus, I just love these old pictures of them because they're awesome. So 2020, which was not a good year for much of anything, was a good year to continue work I started back in 2016 and have been piecing together ever since, researching a book about the lives and work of the Doctors Brown, thanks to the Lloyd Library and Museum. That's why I want to begin my talk with just a slide of gratitude. My thanks to writer and teacher Annette Wick, who's a supportive friend who first told me there were Lloyd Fellowships. She's there at the top. My thanks also to Lloyd Executive Director, Patricia Van Skyke, who told me a bit more about the fellowships and allowed me to dream my project into being. Her creativity and leadership have really re-energized the Lloyd's programs, and I'm proud to be a part of it. Thanks also especially to Lloyd Reference and Technology Librarian Erin Campbell, there in the bottom, whose steady support and adaptability kept my stress at bay throughout the unexpected twists and turns wrought by COVID-19. Patricia and Erin allowed me to believe I could still finish a project, even though it changed form and shifted a bit, that would illuminate treasures in the Lloyd archives and lift up the stories of pioneering women scientists in Cincinnati. I owe them, as well as all of the Lloyd family, all my friends and colleagues who have listened to my incessant stories about the Brown sisters, especially Frances Huffman, my deep thanks. So tonight, I'm going to be talking about Annette, Lucy, and Elizabeth because it's Women's History Month, and this is the culmination of my fellowship. So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper first into why we are talking about these Walnut Hills born sisters at all. Annette, seen here, was the first woman to earn a PhD from UC, and that was 1911. She was 27 years old. And in her 60-plus year career as a world-renowned entomologist, she identified and named nearly 1/4 of all species of Microlepidoptera, which is a tiny, tiny moth that we know of today. 1 out of 4, not a bad record. And you can see on this slide an image of that Annette drew and hand painted from her, actually it's from her dissertation. It's beautiful artwork. She was an amazing artist as well. Annette's only sister, Lucy, who was 5 years younger, earned the third PhD granted to a woman at the University of Cincinnati. That was in 1914, and she was 25. Now, every botanist and plant ecologist working today knows the name Dr. Lucy Brown, who authored the essential reference book on Eastern North American deciduous forests. You see the first cover of it there, including forests in Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. Oh, and Virginia. And that was in 1950 is when that book came out. Now, some of those botanists and ecologists might extol the brilliance of E. Lucy Braun, which is understandable because of the American pronunciation of that last name. But in German, the name is pronounced much more like how we pronounce the name, the color, brown. And since the Brown family stuck with the more accurate pronunciation of their last name, I do too. Before starting this fellowship, I had already spent time in the university's collection of archives and rare books, the Cincinnati History Library, the New York Botanical Garden Library, and the Hunt Botanical Library to track down information about the Browns. When I learned about Elizabeth Brockschlager's collection at the Lloyd, I thought it might offer me a fresh gateway into the lives of the Brown sisters. What I didn't expect was to come away from the experience with a much more intimate look into the sisters' relationship with their younger colleague and the depth and the breadth of their conservation work together. Oh, and I wanted to point out the picture here. Both of these pictures are from the Lloyd collection of Elizabeth Brockschlager. The one in the upper right is Elizabeth a little bit, I believe this is 1965, and she is at the Cincinnati Nature Center with none other than Richard Durrell, who was one of the founders of the Nature Center, a student of Lucy Brown's, and who, along with his wife, Lucille, are actually the namesakes of the Edge of Appalachia Nature Preserve, which you may have heard of before. And we'll get to that later. All right, so for tonight, I'm going to focus on three main topics about these trailblazing women scientists in Cincinnati. So the first, as you can see here, is how the city played an important role in nurturing and informing both Annette and Lucy's passions for science and discovery, and how they shared that passion with students and with the bigger community. Then I'm going to talk a little bit more about how Annette and Lucy's sisterhood and symbiotic fields of research both expanded their opportunities to break a lot of barriers and forge their personal and professional interdependence. Finally, I'm going to end up talking about how the sisters' lasting legacy is land that they championed and land that their students and followers also champion, land that they saved from developers, land that they preserved for scientists to study and species to inhabit, and in the end, land that can teach us how our planet works and how interdependent we all are. All right, here we are, topic one, the sisters and their passions for science and discovery. Annette and Lucy grew up in Walnut Hills, this neighborhood of Cincinnati, in the late 1800s. Their parents, George and Emma, were educators, and they met while teaching in Cincinnati public schools. While George went on to serve as principal of the Webster School, which was in Over the Rhine, once Emma became a mother, the family home on May Street became her classroom, and her daughters became her star pupils. Now, up in the slide on the upper left is Webster School, where George Brown was principal. From the beginning, George and Emma encouraged their daughters, who were their only children, to explore nature, according to former student and close friend, Lucille Durrell. Remember that name. The Browns would travel via horse-drawn streetcar from Walnut Hills to the woods in Rose Hill, an area that now, if you're in the city of Cincinnati, is in Avondale. The Victorian-bred parents taught their young girls to recognize and name plants by both their common and scientific names. And in doing so, they inspired their daughters' lifelong joy in discovering species and helping others to do the same. Annette and Lucy's mother, Emma, kept a colorful garden on May Street. She also loved collecting and pressing flowers into artfully designed herbarium pages, a practice she passed along to Lucy, who was already an avid collector and presser of Cincinnati plants when she was in high school. On this slide, you'll see an herbarium page. That page was done by Emma Braun. Emma Braun. It was once attributed to Lucy, but this is the mother who did this beautiful page. And there's some great examples of that at the Cincinnati History Museum. DeVere Burt, who in the late 1970s bought and still lives in the Brown home in Mount Washington, which the sisters referred to as Brownwood, was a close friend of Annette's during the last decade of her life in the 1970s. He explained to me just how big of an influence Emma had on her daughters, and I want to quote him here. She took them into the woods. She instilled the love of nature in them. When they were young girls, they were given 2 begonias, and they were given the responsibility of caring for them. Their mother said, "I'm not taking care of these. These are your responsibility to care for." And the girls nurtured and cared for them all their lives and brought them to Brownwood. And they were here when both of them passed. And I'd like to add that they are still there today under the tender care of DeVere and Pat Burt. So both Annette and Lucy graduated from the public Woodward High School. This is Old Woodward, and that's a picture in the bottom right on this slide. It was also their mother's alma mater. It was also William Howard Taft's alma mater. Annette, who was the first to graduate, was also the first to enroll in the University of Cincinnati, which was free for white city residents, even women, to attend. She started attending classes in 1902, which was the same year that, according to a board report, the University Museum, which you got to remember there was no Natural History Museum at the time, received a donation of 300 birds and 1,300 insects. That included hundreds of the species, very much like those that would become a big part of her life's work and earn her worldwide acclaim. And I like to think that's where Annette's love of bug really took flight. Next, we go to the University of Cincinnati. Now, in 1903, the entire university population numbered at just a bit more than 1,000 students. Annette was one of 3 sophomores to receive an honorary scholarship. All 3 winners were women. In 1905, Annette also received one of 5 McMicken scholarships. Of those 5, 3 went to women. Now, there's a whole other story about Charles McMicken and the racist stipulations for the use of his money in 1855, when he first purchased land for the university, that included forbidding admission to Black students. So I think it's important to mention here that for all the ways that the Brown sisters have been overlooked by history, they were nonetheless supported in studying at the university. These were the early white days of the university that would lead to later white days and to what remains to this day a predominantly white institution that has never quite reflected the racial and ethnic diversity of the city in which it sits. In 1904, students in botany and zoology helped start the university's first student organization. You see its name on this slide, the Blue Hydra Society. Both Lucy and Annette would become members, and in Lucy's case, a faculty leader. So aside from their super cool logo, and I believe this is from the 1970 Cincinnati yearbook of the university, here's just one example of why the Blue Hydras mattered, both for the Browns and for the city at large. In the winter of 1917, when the students in this group coordinated to bring world famous photographs of the Antarctic to town for the first time ever. No one in Cincinnati had seen these photographs. They donated proceeds from 2 showings they had to a campaign to support the Cincinnati Zoological Garden, an early recognition of the importance of botanical gardens to what was coexisting then and still today with the zoo. I think that's kind of cool. In university yearbook after university yearbook, the Blue Hydras, a club that in most years was made up of many more women than men, those members proudly pose alongside their motto, once a Blue Hydra, always a Blue Hydra. Here's some more of these beautiful moth pictures from Annette's dissertation. The university had given out fewer than half a dozen doctorate degrees in 1911, when Annette became the first woman to earn the honor. Now here's a quote from the Dean of Women that year, quote, "Of the degrees of Doctor of Philosophy, none was gained with higher honor than that conferred upon Miss Annette Braun for her brilliant work in biology," unquote. Now, at this point in the school's history, students who earned a PhD had to read both French and German, name a major and 2 minor areas of study, and put 100 copies of their thesis in the library. Annette's, of course, included some of these beautiful illustrations. But I also want to point out that Annette's life wasn't just focused on campus. The same year she earned her PhD in 1911, she gave a lecture, and I love the name of this lecture, Our Bird Park at Home, at the June meeting of the Cincinnati Audubon Society. She told the audience about how she had trained different birds to visit her Walnut Hills backyard for food and water. The announcement of the meeting in the Cincinnati Enquirer of that year is the earliest recorded mention I've found about Annette's lifelong devotion to studying birds. And there's a photo here on this slide of Charles Clifton Brittlebank, who was an Australian botanist and farmer who was pretty well known in his day and significantly older than Annette. But there are records of Annette and C.C. Brittlebank exchanging letters, which he beautifully illustrated with his own drawings of butterflies and different moths in 1903 and 1904. And chances are C.C. Brittlebank had little suspected that his pen pal in America, who was sending him samples, was barely over 20 years old. But that's just how that's just how Annette rolled. All right. So Lucy, who received her bachelor's degree in geology, earned her PhD in botany just 3 years after Annette. Only one other student, Ralph Edward Osper, earned a PhD in 1914, the same year as Lucy. Now, for anyone familiar with the chemistry department at UC, that name, Osper, might sound familiar because of the Osper collection, which is now its own mini museum on campus in the Zimmer Hall, and it's named in honor of the late professor who shared the graduation stage with Lucy Brown. Well, actually, they didn't share a stage because the men graduates and the women graduates had separate stages. The commencement speaker that year in 1914 made a point of clarifying that in his talk, because he said he liked to look at one side of the crowd versus the other. Let's see. Both sisters took on teaching roles at UC after they earned their doctorates. At first, they primarily taught teachers. And this is where we start to learn even more about how the city infused their learning and how they connected with students like Elizabeth Brockschlager, who earned her Bachelor's of Science in Elementary Education at the university in 1928. So from university records, we know that Annette began teaching a class called Insect Life, a Saturday course for local school teachers. That was in 1912, and the class included both field trips and lectures. She also taught an animal biology lab course and co-taught a class in the School of Household Arts called Elementary Zoology, with a lab that highlighted, quote, certain selected forms of importance in the household. Not really sure what that means, but if anyone knows what that means, I would love to hear it. I don't know if it means dogs, cats, rats, or something else. Lucy, whose dissertation had focused on Cincinnati's physiographic ecology, gave lectures and plant biology classes for the College of Teachers, and soon began helping teach a class called City Botany, which included 2 field trips and 1 lecture every week. Now, city botany was required for anyone who wanted to teach botany or biology at the secondary school level or who wanted to teach nature study in elementary schools. Lucy slowly, and I do mean slowly, rose through the academic ranks that you see. It would take her 32 years to be promoted to the rank of full professor. Still, she used her influence to raise awareness of the importance of local ecosystems and their preservation, often by bringing like-minded academic and public groups together. A natural pair of collaborators was the Blue Hydra Society and the Wildflower Preservation Society, which Lucy and Annette helped lead. Annette was a longtime treasurer of the local chapter of the Wildflower Preservation Society. She was in charge of keeping tabs of the $1 per year dues that entitled members to preview invitations to monthly lectures and the Society's national publication, Wildflower. Lucy was the editor of that national publication for 5 years, and that ensured that news of Ohio's and its native species remained on the national botanical radar. In 1928, the Wildflower Preservation Society teamed with the Blue Hydra Society and the Civic Department and Art Department of Cincinnati Public Schools to host a rather remarkable wildflower exhibition at Fleischman Gardens in Avondale for 3 days in the spring. They had high hopes about the impact of showcasing native shrubs, ferns, and wildflowers for the public. This was just 3 years after heirs to the yeast magnate, Charles Fleischman, yes, that Fleischman, donated his 4-acre home and beautifully landscaped park to the city. And in this slide, you'll see a photo of Fleischman Gardens in those early years. Also an Ohio Wildflower Preservation Society pamphlet. And there's a picture of the blue hydras, and Lucy is in the 2nd row. She's the 2nd from the right in the back row. And those coats look pretty awesome, if you ask me, even if you don't ask me. All right. Recognizing and understanding the importance of Cincinnati's native species was an ongoing campaign for the sisters. In 1930, Lucy lectured at the Walnut Hills Library, which you see here, about the history of Cincinnati's vegetation from the Ice Age on. In October 1931, Lucy again lectured, again at the Walnut Hills Library, which was the regular gathering spot for the Cincinnati Wildflower Preservation Society, that in addition to the Walnut Hills High School Auditorium. And that day, in 1931, she lectured about summer flowers of nearby woods and fields. You can see the invitation to that lecture here on this slide. She used colored lantern slides of photos she'd taken herself, and members of the public were always encouraged to attend. I like this slide because you can see not only the invitation to one of the lectures, but a prayer from the Ohio chapter of the Wildflower Preservation Society, which was really the Cincinnati chapter, and also one of the beautiful botanical illustrations that the Wildlife Preservation Society used to educate its members and the public. So while this section has focused primarily on the sisters' connection to the city and its impact on their work while they lived in Walnut Hills, rest assured that after they moved to Brownwood and Mount Washington, that connection continued. It expanded to include new friends and fellow naturalists who also called the woods of the neighborhood home and allowed them to plant and nurture an experimental garden that kept Elizabeth Brockschlager busy when she house sat for them as they took their motor trips to the West. So this next section of the talk will be focused on the interdependence and partnership of their research. And I came to appreciate this in new ways as I worked with the Elizabeth Brockschlager collection at the Lloyd. Now, the common narrative about the Browns goes something like this. Lucy, though she was younger, was tougher and bossier than her older sister, who was more of a caretaker by nature. Lucy, the stories go, called all the shots and was even known to say on occasion that no one wanted to look at Annette's ugly bugs. But after reading their letters, researching their educational histories, and talking with those who knew them and reading the letters of those who knew them, I've come to a different conclusion. My take on the Doctors Brown, they were equals. In fact, I believe that Lucy Brown's success came in no small part due to the presence and partnership of her older sister. Likewise, Annette's work and life was expanded thanks to Lucy and her research. Through it all, their symbiotic relationship was much more about shared opportunities than has been previously understood. So let's start with oh, I went ahead too fast, sorry. Let's start with the scientific interconnections of their work. Annette studied leaf miners, the tiny larvae of micromoths whose invisible existence sits as the basis for natural ecosystems. How does it do that? Well, these tiny moths eat specific plant leaves, and then they serve as food for other creatures, including Annette's beloved birds, that also serve as seed dispersal systems. The survival of these plant species, which feed other species on up the food chain, is essential for the survival of the ecosystems. Moths, Annette knew, make a difference. So in her work, Annette not only had to know how to differentiate between different insects inside leaves and species, microleps can only be identified by dissecting their genitals, by the way, but also the plant species they called hosts. So while Lucy was a great partner in helping identifying plants and leaves, Annette could most assuredly hold her own. In fact, without Annette by her side, it's impossible to imagine Lucy completing the 65,000 plus miles of travel necessary to complete her book, her 1950 classic book about deciduous forests. And I don't mean that Annette was only there to do the laundry or pack bags. She was a research partner. And Lucy, who I have no doubt was a proud and strong-willed woman, surely had very good reason to dedicate that book, which was the premier accomplishment of her career, to her sister. My research suggests that they fed off of each other's expertise, with Annette assisting Lucy with plant identification and editing, and Lucy providing opportunities for Annette to focus on what she loved best, collecting, dissecting, and identifying tiny moths, and, time permitting, training the birds in their backyard. In their letters, it's clear to see the sisters' partnership. They took turns documenting their days via letters back to their friend, colleague, and house sitter, Elizabeth Brockschlager, who was also a teacher and respected botanist in her own right. It was a familiar pattern. One night, Annette would be busy with specimens and merely send along her best via Lucy. Another night, Annette would write as Lucy was focused on organizing samples she'd collected in the field. Lucy was always the driver. Annette never learned how to drive. That allowed Annette to view the countryside and avoid the stress of navigating sometimes treacherous roads. Packing lunches in return seems like more than a fair trade. They shared delights in spotting new species and dramatic landscapes, even as they edged toward 80 years of age. Their lifelong knowledge of what it took to get along seems born not only of familiarity, but also of mutual respect. I argue that together the sisters accomplished more than they could have independently, largely because of the obstacles faced by women scientists and women in academia in general in the early 20th century. For example, Lucy continued to teach at the University of Cincinnati until she took early retirement in 1948 at the age of 59, with her best years of research still ahead of her. Notice that her seminal book was published after she was out of the classroom. Annette, on the other hand, dropped off of course listings in 1917, the same year their father died. Based on what I've read by and about Annette, I think her exit from professional academia was, yes, partly to be at home with her mother after her father's death, but also due to a continued lack of status, title, and agency in the university. While male instructors who did not have doctorates were being assigned upper-level courses to teach, Annette was relegated to assisting in labs and leading weekend courses for teachers. I may be projecting, as someone who has spent time in academia myself, but I can only imagine how hard that must have been for the university's first woman doctor. Leaving the politics of UC allowed Annette to ramp up her research career. And at the same time, she could still access some of the benefits of academic research via Lucy's continued teaching and dogged determination to earn full professor status. After 1917, Annette's scientific life flourished as she accompanied Lucy on countless trips, remained an international expert to whom microlepidopods from around the world relied on for help, named hundreds of new species, and amassed a collection of 30,000 mini moths in their home. In some ways, I feel like Annette got the better end of the sister deal. Now I move on to the legacy. Sorry about that slide mix-up. The final point of my talk, the legacy of Annette and Lucy Braun, is land. Their heroic efforts to support land conservation and preservation is obvious at the 20,000 acres at the edge of Appalachia in Adams County, Ohio. Those acres, regularly explored by Annette, Lucy, and Elizabeth Brockschlager, as well as generations of students and fellow nature lovers, are owned by the Nature Conservancy and managed by the Cincinnati Museum Center. Well, I hope you've already heard about the Edge. You may not have heard about the $100 donation in 1959 that secured the first land purchase of what has become Ohio's largest nature preserve. It was from Elizabeth Brockschlager as part of the Lynx Prairie Project, spearheaded after much prodding from Lucy by the Nature Conservancy. And on this slide, you can see the Lynx Prairie Project image, and in paragraph 5, there is a description of the Miss Elizabeth Brockschlager's donation of $100, which was a lot for a Cincinnati public school teacher at the time, to donate to preserve that first piece of land. The protected area of the E. Lucy Braun Lynx Prairie has now been expanded by thousands of acres, and the Edge itself bears the name of Richard and Lucille Durrell. Remember them? Former students, friends, partners in conservation. They were Lucy's undergraduate students and major donors. The Durrell's environmental impact can be measured by their work for and support of Hamilton County Park District and the Cincinnati Nature Center, which we saw the pictures of before. Oh, and this picture is another picture of Elizabeth, Lucy, Annette, and then a mysterious fourth woman I don't know at a celebration in the very, very beginning, maybe even before the Cincinnati Nature Center opened to the public in 1965. So that would make Annette in her 80s and Lucy pretty close to 80 at this point, and Elizabeth is on the far left, taking her seat beside them. Now, decades before the Edge took shape, the sisters shared their lifelong love of field trips with hundreds of students and nature enthusiasts, and often that meant staying closer to home than driving out west or as far away even as the Edge. In Montgomery, Ohio, the Blue Hydras and botany students often frequented 65 acres known first as Hazelwood Nature Preserve, where they tracked species both native and invasive. And one great story from the early 1920s is Lucille Durrell wrote, Lucy encouraged the Blue Hydras to raise money to buy the land. Members sold homemade candy 2 days a week to the engineering students as part of that effort. I'm happy to say that today that land is owned by UC and still used for research by faculty and students. And they're still basing some of their work off of those early measurements and plant countings and plant identifications from Lucy's days. In 1926, Lucy led an initiative to buy and save an unexpected prairie she had discovered while on a field trip in Claremont County. She'd taken her students there to study the rare landscape and hoped desperately to preserve it. This prairie, she knew, was more vulnerable than harder to reach wilderness areas because the land around it had already been donated to the Boy Scouts of America. In the end, though, the Boy Scouts won the day, and the owner donated all of his land for what is now known as Camp Friedlander, which still attracts campers from around the world. That was 1926, and it wasn't all bad news for the wildflower lovers in the city. The Cincinnati Wildflower Preservation Society, which by then boasted more than 700 adult members, launched a campaign to preserve the beauty of nature's estates. It was a Don't Pick the Wildflowers campaign, complete with lists and pictures of native wildflowers that had been identified as in danger of overpicking. You can see here a newspaper article about that campaign that notes the importance of the Junior Wildflower League, which at the time had amassed 25,000 members, and they were helping spread the word about the importance of preserving wildflowers in nature. Quick perspective check. Today's population of Cincinnati public school students is approximately 36,000 students in total. 25,000 students were campaigning to save the wildflowers. It's pretty impressive. No mention of the sisters' work to preserve forests would be complete without mentioning the big trees of leatherwood in Perry County, Kentucky. That's the final picture here with the with the red circle around Lucy to show her perspective and size. This historic battle to save them started in 1935. The National Park Service records detail one of Lucy's impassioned pleas to save the land that had already been sold to a logging company. She wrote, and I quote, or she said, and I quote, "Down in the southern part of Perry County on Lynn Fork of Leatherwood Creek is one of the most beautiful tracts of virgin forest I have ever seen. For some time, I had heard of the big poplar of Perry County, and it was while on the quest for this that I saw this magnificent forest. It occupies the left fork of Lynn Fork, and for some 2 miles, we walked through untouched forest, following a faint trail which led to the big poplar, a gigantic tulip tree, nearly 24 feet in circumference, breast high. It took 5 people with arms outstretched to reach around the tree. This gigantic trunk towered upward, unbranched, to such heights that it was impossible to distinguish the leaves of the crown. Nowhere east of California have I seen such a gigantic tree." Unquote. Lucy was always out in front, making speeches about the importance of preservation, while Annette's letter writing and organizing were also essential to the efforts. In the case of Leatherwood, the effort to save the forest ultimately failed. But in its failure, you can see the seeds of the successes in Adams County years later. Instead of appealing to local and federal government officials as she had with the Perry County land, Lucy leveraged the power of the Nature Conservancy and the press as she convinced donors, many of whom could donate much more than Elizabeth Brockschlager, to buy and then donate the land. As much as I like to say that the sisters' legacy was land, I have to point out that their legacy was also people. People like Richard and Lucille Durrell, people like Elizabeth Brockschlager, whose early investment secured that first piece of the edge of Appalachia, where a preserve is now named in her honor. But Brockschlager's legacy, I discovered in my fellowship research, is much more than the edge. She was deeply involved in the early days of the Cincinnati Nature Center. She also embedded her love of botany and passion for environmental conservation in her classrooms. Remember, she was a Cincinnati public school teacher for more than 40 years. I'll finish by sharing one more story about the Browns' legacy of land conservation. And this one caught me totally by surprise, and it hits very close to home, my home in the Cincinnati neighborhood of Northside. It turns out Elizabeth was very involved in the fight to preserve Northside Woods, which she described as, quote, "a small remnant of the vast deciduous forest which originally covered all of southwestern Ohio. It has trees up to 47.5 inches in diameter, at least 100 feet tall, and more than 200 years old." That fight began in 1969, when a neighbor launched a newspaper recycling campaign to raise money to buy the 18 acres of rare forest in industrial Northside. The first donation came from a familiar name, Lucille Durrell. That neighbor then enlisted the support and help of the Greater Cincinnati Tree Council, a group that had grown out of and was mostly rooted in, pun intended, the Wildflower Preservation Society. But the Tree Council was known for its quiet yet dogged efforts to buy land to keep it out of the hands of developers. In 1970, there was a newspaper article about the forest, begins with a quote from Lucy. This was just 1 year before she died, so 1970. And she says, "How such a piece of woods could have escaped destruction in its setting is amazing." The campaign to buy the land garnered plenty of press coverage. Here are just a few of the headlines I found in Elizabeth's collection. "A rare forest thrives in industrial Northside. Preservation of forest gets support. Drive on to save tree tract. Club invites hikers along on Northside Woods tour. Kids campaign to save trees. Plans to buy forests near reality. City Tree Council quietly gets action. But Elizabeth Brockschlager did more than collect news clippings. Following in her mentor's footsteps, she led tours of the forest and talked with potential donors, making the case for the importance of protecting the land and the life on it. She suggested constructing trails, and I feel certain encouraged her students to be part of that newspaper recycling drive. The Northside neighbor who first drew attention to the virgin forest even sent Elizabeth Brockschlager a handwritten note a day after guided public tours. Quote, "I was so glad I was able to go with one of your groups, as I felt an even deeper awareness of its value through your eyes." Most of all the pieces that make up Northside Woods, which is now called Buttercup Valley, were purchased by the Tree Council in 1972 for $51,000. The council then donated it to the Cincinnati Park Board and to turn into a virgin nature preserve, a dream that was realized when Buttercup Valley was dedicated on Arbor Day in 1974. Now, I don't know if you've been to Buttercup Valley, but if you haven't, you should. It's a remarkable respite from the city in the city. I've loved it for more than 2 decades. And when I found out the role that these pioneering women scientists had in saving it, I realized that their stories, no matter how overlooked in general, would keep finding me until I did something more about it and started to tell them to others. One entrance to Buttercup Valley is on the same street as my first home in Northside. Another is just down the block from my 4th Northside home. So yes, land is their legacy, but that legacy of land is filtered through, enjoyed by, and dependent upon their lasting impact on people. And as of tonight, that includes you. Thank you so much for your time. That's it. I've got an in-house cheerleader.
So thank you so much, Elissa. Let's see, we have a lot of thank yous from the audience. We have a couple of questions as well. And for everybody in the audience, if questions come up, certainly shoot them our way through the chat. So Elissa, one question is, do you find that visits to the edge of Appalachia provide you with a deeper understanding of the Browns and Brockschlager's work?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's so inspiring to go there and to, especially having read and seen their notes and their descriptions of their own walks and hearing the stories about their own time there. Often when I'm there, I imagine what it was like before there was any official trail there and how they must have really been pretty rugged to get through the woods and find those prairies and find those different species. It's such an inspiring place to be, and it's so wonderful that they were able to share that space with so many other people, and now it continues to grow today.
Thanks. So Robert is just commented that he's very happy to hear about the story of Buttercup Preserve. It's my favorite place to hike in Cincinnati, he said.
It's awesome.
We have a question from Lynette. Did Elizabeth Brockschlager ever travel with the Browns?
Well, she certainly was with them in Adams County and spent a lot of time with them in that part. She led tours with them. She also helped expose the area to potential donors and other supporters. I haven't seen evidence of her going out west with them. I think she mostly stayed here in Cincinnati, partially for her family and partially because of her school teaching responsibilities. She taught mostly 5th through 8th grades and mostly in the more urban schools, more the city schools. And a really interesting story is that I get all the Mallorys confused, but the first Mallory to become a House Speaker or House Leader in the state of Ohio House was one of her students.
Yeah, William Mallory.
Well, thank you, William Mallory.
So we have a question about this is from Mary, why isn't the work of the Brown sisters more celebrated at UC? And is there hope of correcting this omission?
Yes, absolutely. That's my whole, that's been a big part of my, I think, inspiration. And I see Meg Hanrahan was here. Meg has done an amazing documentary film that is available on PBS about Lucy primarily, and that has helped sort of bring her name more into the forefront. But I certainly hope that once my campaign was always to get a statue of the sisters put up at UC and to have a little bit more recognition of the value that they brought to the university, and that they have this great reputation outside of the city. So we certainly hope to work to make that happen.
So the last question that we have is from Michelle. Oh, wait, I don't see what the question is, though.
Is it going to be a larger work?
Oh, yes, thank you. It already had popped off my screen. Yes.
I like that. I've got some plants in the audience here. Absolutely. My hope is to take the work from this fellowship and the other research that I've done and turn that into a full book about the sisters and their amazing impact. I think some of the problem with them remaining single all their lives, Elizabeth Brockschlager was also single. They didn't have necessarily a built-in legacy of having all their stuff in one place and people to kind of carry their stories forward. So they certainly have a lot of fans out there in the world, and I see a major motion picture one day for sure.
Well, thank you, Elissa, and thanks everyone for coming tonight. I'd like to mention that programs like these are supported by members of the Lloyd Library. And if you're a member, thank you very much. If you'd like to know more about the Lloyd Library or become a member, visit our website at www.lloydlibrary.org. I also would like to mention that this program and other webinars are available on our Lloyd Library YouTube channel. And if you'd like to listen to the podcast that Elissa described tonight, Dear Elizabeth, and other podcasts, listen to Between the Leaves, produced by the Lloyd Library. And Elissa is a partner on this project as well. So thank you very much and hope to see you next time.
Can I give a quick little shout out? I'm sorry. I wanted to
Sure.
say thank you because the Dear Elizabeth podcast actually includes snippets from amazing letters from Lucy and Annette to Elizabeth, and they are read by Dr. Teresa Cully, plays the role of Lucy Brown, which is wonderful because she's a wonderful botanist who follows in Lucy's footsteps in a lot of ways. And Annette's letters are read by the amazing Anita Buck, who does a lot of work in Northside with Northside Green Space and is very familiar with the Buttercup Valley. So I'm really, really appreciative to them for giving their time to bring those letters to life.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you.